I'm Gail Beckett. I'm the president of the Board of Trustees here at the CAC, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and thank you for coming to this truly amazing night, the opening of A Permanent Nostalgia of Departure. It's really the celebration of the 20th anniversary of this glorious, iconic building that Zaha built for us. A few of us, I have to tell you, a few of us did have a sneak preview last night, hosted by many of the artists that are here, and also followed by a lovely cocktail reception by Moose Sinclair, and I haven't seen him, but thank you to him. And all I can tell you from that sneak preview is we are in for a true delightful treat. I was so energized about the elegance and the energy and the connectivity of everything that's going on our 4th and 5th floors. I think you will be truly as excited as I was about this magical installation. So I will leave it there. And without further ado, I will turn it over to people who know way more about this art than I do. And I'm so thrilled to introduce, again, our relatively new, 5-month-old, exuberant, and very excited to be here, Christina Vassallo, our Executive Director of the Contemporary Arts Center. And let me not take your speech with me.
Thank you, Gail. It's okay if you take it with you because I actually think I'm going to speak from the heart. You're totally right, Gail. There's so much energy in this room. And another thing I just want to sort of put my finger on is as I've gotten to know Cincinnati and how people respond to the CAC and the building, the Lois and Richard Rosenthal Center for Contemporary Arts, what strikes me is the sense of ownership that you all have. Those of you who have lived in this city for, as long as the building has been up, and before then, those of you who participated in the selection process, maybe watched from the sidelines and said it was possible, it could never happen. Guess what? It did. We're seated here together today. Those of you who were architecture students and studied Zaha and this building, I just learned today that our curator, Maite Borjabad López Pastor, actually analyzed this building during her studies, so I feel like she's closing the circle by coming here. We've had the pleasure of working with her for nearly 2 years on this project. It absolutely was a labor of love for all of the artists, for my staff, and for Maite. And now I'm going to stick to the script because I want to make sure I don't lose anything important. This exhibition was timed to recognize the 20th anniversary of this building alongside our gala on October 7th, which will be themed around this building and in recognition of it, and a whole year of upcoming programming that celebrates how unique this building is. We're gathered here tonight in an icon of Cincinnati that has had such a resounding influence on all of the numerous artists and visitors who have danced with Zaha's design. Zaha herself wrote of the concept during the CAC selection process. Neutral space is a wishful oxymoron. All space is covered by individual memory and experience. Multiple perceptions and distant views free the sanctified object and instead create a more perplexing, richer, phenomenal experience where the body is taken through a journey of compression, release, reflection, disorientation, and epiphany. So in this exhibition on the 4th and 5th floors, you'll see fresh perspectives on the perplexing experience of this building by artists from around the world. They play with the visitor's epiphany that Zaha predicted through 7 newly commissioned architectural interventions and artworks that our guest curator, Maite, organized alongside important archival materials and works by Zaha herself. I want to thank the staff now who made the impossible possible. And I'm going to name every member of our exhibitions and education departments because they are the true heroes this evening, alongside of all of the participating artists and our guest curator. Erin Adelman, Amara Antila, David Dillon, Tyler Hamilton, Rebecca Roman, Elizabeth Harden-Clank, Shawnee Turner, and of course our incredibly devoted install team. They're just phenomenal. And if you see them, just give them a high five. Yeah, thank you. Of course, I also want to recognize our incredible Board of Trustees. Just raise your hand. I see a few of you here among us. Thank you for your devotion to this organization. Our donors, the exhibition sponsors, and our partners, who are all recognized by name in the exhibition pamphlet, some of whom have been with us since before this building came to fruition. So soon, Maite will take the stage to say a few words about the exhibition, but she'll then introduce and engage with Khyam Allami in a conversation about his sound work in the exhibition, A Relational Music Rehearsal. And afterwards, we invite you to join us in the upper lobby for refreshments and on floors 4 and 5 to experience the exhibition. But before that, I'd like to say a few words about Maite. Just to give you a grounding in where she's coming from. She is a curator, a trained architect, and researcher whose work revolves around diverse forms of critical spatial practices operating across architecture, art, and performance. Having worked with and within many major museums, including the Metropolitan Museum and Guggenheim Bilbao, she describes her curatorial practice as institutional infiltration, and it's been a pleasure being lovingly infiltrated as an institution by her over these past 2 years, and I've had the opportunity to engage with her over the last 5 months. I got to sneak in under the wire to be associated with this phenomenal exhibition, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Maite. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here to share this special moment with us all. Thank you, Christina, for the lovely introduction. I want to add myself to all the grateful words that she has shared. And before share with you some background information about this exhibition, I want to make sure that you understand that I'm here personalizing a big group of artists. Most of them, you're likely to have them all here present with you. So I want to name them all so you fully understand the density of brains and souls that have made this possible. I'm not going to do it in alphabetical order. I'm going to do it in a spatial order, more or less, on how you're going to encounter them. So all of these have been possible with the participation of the artists Rand Abdul Jabbar. We have also Dima Ezruji. We have Hira Buyuktasyan. We have Andrea Canepa. We have Khyam Allami. And we have Emil Rai, and we have the duo of civil architecture, Ali Karimi and Hamed Bouhamsin, if I did that correct. It's a challenge with so many names. So everything I'm about to share, it's truly a collective voice. There is a lot of plurality and multidisciplinarity in this, and I really want to just give you some nuance of the thinking behind this and then really invite you to explore that by your own. When I received the invitation to curate an exhibition in this amazing institution and building to honor the legacy of Zaha Hadid, that was a major responsibility, especially because legacy usually is understood, and when we engage with legacy, it's understood through a very monolithic and static way. When engaging with legacy, usually it's done through exhibition making by doing what is usually called a monographic exhibition, and you narrate the view of an artist through their own ambitions and expectations. However, I thought it was much more interesting and also a honor to Zaha Hadid to see her legacy to flow through other people, other artists' legacy. Usually when a painting, a drawing, a poem, a sound piece, a composition enters the world and emancipates the author, and then that work is encountered by another artist and is assimilated and is digested and engaged through their own personal interests and their own cultural backgrounds, their own situated responses with their interests, then that legacy starts to evolve and becomes something else. So this has been literally a rehearsal into accelerating that process that already happens in all creative practices. Influence, inspiration, it's always part of the creative process. So the way of proposing an engagement with Zaha Hadid legacy has been inviting this amazing roster of artists to engage with her as freely as they would have considered, and to situate the encounter with her through very personal lenses. In this, the result actually, in some cases, might be really traceable. In other cases, not necessarily, because they have all poured a lot of generosity and vulnerability to truly engage and learn from the legacy that Zaha Hadid has created, not just into the surface, but really understanding her methodology of work, her inspirations, also her persona. So you would encounter a series of works, all of them in full symbiosis with the space, but also with her logic of thought, that truly covers since methodological revelations on how she worked and how that is applied to another discipline, to a different materiality, or to aesthetic imaginary that is not necessarily what she did, but also a lot of very personal inquiries that have challenged the understanding of Zaha Hadid, not just as that public persona that we all knew, but really have pushed the limit to understand who was she as the very first Iraqi architect that made it in this star system, the very first Iraqi woman, first Middle Eastern woman, first of many things. That is a really heavy weight to carry on the shoulders, and that implied many decisions for her. And in those ways, all the engagement from all the artists has actually challenged and deciphered many of those adventures that she had to face, that we have maybe consumed through a very hygienized way, and they have had the vulnerability to really start digging and asking questions that usually are not asked against the legacy of an artist. Accompanying their presence and this full symbiosis of their practice and Zaha Hadid, there are a few paintings and ephemera, mostly from her early period, and that was very deliberate because I didn't want to bring final architectural products in a way, but just her early vocabulary, where you could see the early way of thinking, how she created her own systems to liberate herself from even representational tools and start creating a new system of thought and imagination. And those paintings and drawings and methodologies have full potential to keep expanding and keep knowledge flowing from one brain into another, which is actually what all the artists have generously received, engaged, and have carried with themselves. So with that idea, I want to really thank the artists for engaging truly with your intellect, but also with your soul into doing this. And last but not least, I want to thank the team. Christina has already said that, but I want to also name all of them: Becky, David, Tyler, Cara, Hannah, Corey, Erin, Amara for the invitation, even though she's not here, and many names that I'm sure I'm forgetting that have been in the grounds with us for many long hours to make this exist. So with this, I'm going to invite Khyam into the stage so we can start the conversation. Thank you. So before we start, I think the best way of introducing Khyam is inviting him to share a bit of the research and artistic practice that he has successfully developed for many years, integrating a truthful, deep, and consistent research with the outcome of his artistic practice, to give a bit of a background, and then we can dig into the work that you've done specifically for the exhibition.
Thank you very much. Where do I start? I'll keep it simple. One of my main interests, since I started to study the oud, which is the Middle Eastern lute, which I started studying in London with an Iraqi teacher in 2004, was the concept of tuning and intonation. Some of you may be aware of it, some of you not, but essentially tuning and intonation is the practice of different pitches, different notes that are used in different musical cultures. And when you play a fretless instrument like the oud or the cello or the violin, you have to really develop a sensitivity of listening in order to be able to intone correctly. And I was very much interested also in electronic music and digital tools, but I always struggled to make any connection with those tools, because the tools are generally standardized to what is known today as 12-tone equal temperament. And this is a Anglo-European tonality system that was developed in the 16th, 17th century and took a long time to become fixed in practice. But with the introduction of digital tools, more than the original electric instruments, the digital instruments themselves kind of codified the standard. And that makes it very difficult for musicians like myself to be able to engage with these technologies with the same kind of freedom as other musicians who are working with 12-tone equal temperament and Anglo-European music. So this particular conflict was something that took up a lot of time in my, early 2000s, and then I just dropped it because it was too complicated and became too annoying. And I focused basically on studying the oud, and over the last few years I tried to swing that back and recently completed a doctorate in composition very much based on these kinds of ideas. So that's where I'm at today. This subject of tuning and technology and experimentalism, culturally situated experimentalism, is very close to my heart.
Thank you, Khyam. So with that background as a context, that gives some hints on why I decided to invite Khyam to be part of the exhibition. In the same way that in sound, in architecture, standards mark the limit of our capacity to keep imagining and designing in a different way, even if we want to try to culturally situate what we're trying to do, to escape from colonial ways of organizing systems. There is always a limit which comes mixed from the capacity of our imagination, but also because of the standardization systems that we inhabit through architecture. So that was kind of the beginning of the idea of why I wanted to engage Khyam, as knowing someone that has been challenging the very basics of the system of thought, and how his composition could be also a way of challenging the understanding of architecture. So within that background of how we challenge the standards, we started to work together. And Khyam came here to the CAC, and we worked for quite a long time inside the space and developed certain findings that have been key into the development of the proposal that he's been working on. So could you share some of that initial research that you did in the space and the findings that led you?
Thank you. I mean, all of you know the building very well, so I'm just going to speak freely about the space. When I first encountered it, obviously in the images, one has a difficulty to try and imagine what the space might actually sound like. And the first thing I noticed was a really magical thing in the reverberation of the space. The reason why is because in acoustics, parallel walls are the absolute nightmare of everything. Parallel walls create what they call nodes. You get standing waves. So these are audio waves that get stuck. Their length is replicated equally as they bounce between separate walls. And so they end up having a higher amplitude, a higher level. But when you have no parallel walls, as is in this building, what you get is a phenomenal reverberation that for me is more beautiful than any of the great churches and spaces, industrial spaces, etc., that I've had the pleasure of visiting. Because the reverberation is so pure, it's a very, very smooth, what they call a tail. So when you click your finger, you'll hear it resonate in a very, very smooth way. The beauty of this is that it makes it very pleasurable to hear, to listen to the space. But it also makes it incredibly difficult to work in, to converse in, to sound in, because everything ends up everywhere. And this was it's always difficult to think about sound installations in contemporary art context, specifically in contemporary art spaces, because most of them are all full of parallel walls and there's sound bleed all the time and things are very difficult. And I think one of our first conversations was, what do we do? Do we create something that's localized, that is, inhabiting one corner or one space? Or do we just take over the entire 2 floors of galleries 4 and 5 and use that volume, use the airflow in there as a kind of resonating chamber, as something to work with rather than against, because it's so beautiful. So I think that was our first conversation, and then we found some really magical details. Thank you for fixing the levels. We found some really magical details. For example, when you come down from the 5th floor onto the 4th floor, there's a magical spot right there at the bottom of the ramp where you can hear everything resonating in a really magnificent way. The small room that's hidden around the corner there actually works as a kind of amplifier. Any sound you place in that room ends up in the rest of the building. So thinking about these magic spaces and the way that the entire the galleries functioned as these resonating chambers really pushed us to try and think about the spatialization of the installation before we'd even thought about composition or anything like that. So this was the basic research. And then in order to be able to take some of that home with me, I did what they call, I recorded what they call our impulse responses. And these are essentially the audio thumbprint of a space. It's like the audio fingerprint. And what you do is you send out a tone that goes up and down in pitch, and you record that and then turn it into a reverb. So what that means is I was able to work at home in Berlin, developing this work, whilst having the sound of the space at my fingertips. I didn't need to be here specifically. So this was a really beautiful thing to do, because now these impulse responses exist, and I'll be sure to pass them on to the CAC so that they're part of the archive here and that they're available for other people to use as well. And I'll play you an example of those in a minute so things don't get too abstract.
Thank you, Khyam. So with this wonderful explanation that tackles on the basis on how we decided to confront the relation of the space, it also illustrates an artwork that actually this situation has happened with most of the artworks, where the artwork doesn't exist without the space itself. And that has also meant for most of the artists that the work they've been doing, they couldn't finalize it until being literally here. And they've been finding their works kind of at the same time, right? This, as Khyam has explained, situation of this sound bleed, usually sound bleed is a bit of the nightmare for a curator when they have to, coordinate sound bleeds across the space. And when doing all this research and identifying what I've been calling kind of like the sonic DNA of the space that Khyam found, I decided to say, okay, instead of controlling sound bleed, let's just enhance it and use this space as a full flow of sounds, which is literally as if you would draw a diagram of sound flow. This is how this building is behaving, and what, in a way, through air mostly, Khyam has materialized, and you would really need to experience. So that is one of the bases of the work. The other, let's start digging into the composition and how then he started developing the composition. So maybe it's helpful to share some thoughts and ideas. I think it's not sharing, right? The screen? Okay.
We prepared a few slides and some things. Maybe we could have that up. But before that, I really want to share my gratitude, express my gratitude to the rest of the artists. I felt from the beginning very reluctant to impose this sound installation on everybody's work, and I'm very, very grateful that everybody accepted and allowed me to engage with their works as well. So thank you all very much. I appreciate it. What do I say? Well, obviously, as Christina mentioned, Maite had studied this building, and this is what got me very, very excited during our early conversations, because I knew we would be able to get into very articulate and nuanced details of the way that the building is designed, not only in terms of its measurements and accuracy, but actually in terms of the poetic intent of the building. And this was one of the first images that Maite shared with me about the poetic intent of Zaha, Zaha's idea for this building. And one of the most fascinating things she mentioned to me was, if you see the ground floor space there that's all in the clear perspex, not the colored perspex. For Maite, and correct me if I say this wrong, but for Maite, her understanding was that Zaha constructed the entire top part of the building, like the colored part first, and then decided how much it was going to be elevated. And I found this really, really gorgeous, because when you think of, well, I'm not an architect and I don't know anything about architecture, but I always think you have to start from the ground up, right? That would be the logical thing. But she's like starting in the middle of nowhere and then creating this form and then thinking about how high it's going to be raised. And I found this really, really inspiring and super beautiful, because you start to think about volumes and space and length and width and relationships, right? Proportion or the lack of. And very clearly we can see from this that there aren't really any classical proportions at play, but it is all relational. And this is what got me thinking about this idea of a relational music, which is the title of the work. How can we break all the standards that we're aware of? How can we be incredibly experimental? How can we let our imagination flow, but still maintain a sense of logic and coherence? And I guess a sense of individual identity. And this really mostly came through from our discussions about this particular image. Obviously, that was then developed as we got into the paintings themselves, but this was really the key.
Actually, that was one of the triggers to start thinking and identify many of the elements that became part or ended up being variables that Khyam included into the composition. So in this one is actually the management of air and the void. Although we usually think about this building with the volumes that it occupies, it's actually the relationship with the void, which Khyam has literally occupied. What it's a bit of, it gives the essence also of the whole composition, which is the void that you see in the bottom, and then flows throughout the whole chord of the circulations throughout the ramp. I know there are stairs, but I'm going to keep calling them ramps, because as you see in some, you will see the logic of parallel kind of ramps and layers. It was also core into the decisions of design for this building. There were also that maybe we can jump into some of the following images that inspire part of the conversations, which was not only the poetics of how to relate with the voids and the volumes, but also it's really intricate into the tools of representation. And I'm back into the notion of tools, because there is something really shared into the attitude and decisions that Zaha made that I see resonated with Khyam's practice, which is the intertwined relationship between a situated cultural practice and the relationship with technology and the limitations that we inherit through technology, right? In this case, every time I look at the paintings that Zaha had made, they look today through the lenses of today's world with many digital tools that have been used for architecture. They look like they were done actually already with softwares that today we take for granted. But she was able to create certain perspectives and drawings and spatial articulations that precede those tools. And she managed to create an alternative system that would not respect fully the orthodox axonometric, the floor plan, the section, the perspective. She would learn all of those representation techniques. She would mix them and start using it on her own favor, but not being limited by her. And that's why every time I talk about the aesthetic imaginary that she created herself through the paintings, was the very first step to start imagining something different, so then she could articulate the spaces in a different way. And she needed that space of liberation through the representation itself. That connection between the representation, the digital tools, is also at the core of Khyam practice. And it would be lovely maybe to unpack some of that.
Yeah, well, let's start with something. The other major thing about the building was the urban carpet, which I wasn't aware, but Maite explained to me that it's basically the spinal cord of the entire building. It's what the building kind of leans against and is built on. And there's this idea of bringing the outside in and taking the inside out. And this was also a major inspiration to think about how I can utilize elements of the building and bring them inside the space. So to think about turning the building inside out and onto itself and have it relationally kind of regurgitate something of its own character in some way. So I'll take you, I guess, to the digital tools. This is a tool that I built a couple of years ago with the Counterpoint Studio, who were my collaborators also on this project, Tara Parvienen and Sam Diggins. And this is a tool that allows for the exploration of tuning systems through the web browser. It's open access, it's free, and it's very, very simple to use. Here we have 12-tone equal temperament, the Anglo-European system I was telling you about earlier, and I hope this will work if I just press a button here. We should be able to... Yes, so... That's the standard C major scale that you're all used to hearing. And what this tool allowed me to do was to... let me just jump back. Through these conversations with Maite, we decided to take measurements of certain elements of the building and convert those measurements into a tuning system itself. So this is some of Maite's work. She analyzed the building for me and sent me these beautiful drawings with all the different measurements. So this is the long facade of the building. That's the short facade. And then we have the volumes. That's the entire building's volume. Obviously, these are rounded. They're not 100% accurate. But these are the communication cores. That's the 5th floor, the 4th floor, the 3rd. So that's the offices. And this is the airflow. This is the void. This is the emptiness that's in the space, which is equally valuable for us. So I took all of these different measurements and using a wonderful Excel spreadsheet, I made these tuning systems, and I'd like to just play them for you. See if I can get this to work. So this is what the short facade tuning system sounds like. Let me try and get it here. Very, peculiar. And then the long facade system sounds like this. Sounds the same. Let me just check that. Everything is so slow. No, I'm just going to switch to this because it's going to be easier. So. They say technology. So there's more than one running at the same time. I was organized. You hear that? Sorry, I'll turn it up. Very strange. Beautiful. And then the volumes, the voids, sound like this. Something juicy is happening here. Turn that off. I try to make my life easier sometimes. Very strange. Beautiful. The thing with these experiments is that when you first hear it, it sounds really bizarre. But the more you listen to it, the more beautiful it becomes, and the more it takes on its own kind of identity and characteristic. So using these tools, we are able to do these strange calculations thanks to Maite's great work in doing, taking the AutoCAD files and doing all the analysis, which sounded like a nightmare, and I'm very glad that I had you to do it for me.
So yeah, each of us, we have our own software. Everything he opens, it sounds like a nightmare to me. So luckily we are in our own disciplines properly situated. These that Khyam just shared, let's say, are the foundations of creating a new system that is not inheriting of the harmonic system that he mentioned before. But then coming into how we're going to start working with the composition, then other layers and understanding of tricks and methods and logics of composition that Zaha used became also another layer and ingredients to share with Khyam. On that, as you've seen with some of the paintings, some of the notions that I think were pretty important sharing with Khyam was, on one hand, in this new technique of representation, something that Zaha Hadid makes a lot, it's bridging all this logic of a space, the one dimension, the line, the two dimension, the surface, and the three dimension, which is the volume, that usually have their own logics of representation, again, the section and the elevation, or an axonometric view, or the perspective view. She starts, when you look at some of her paintings, you look at that portion, and you are like, oh, this is an axonometric kind of view, this is a volumetric representation, and then you move your eyes slightly, and then it's actually a kind of a floor plan, a kind of a section, a kind of an axonometric. So she starts really mixing and moving between the 1, 2, and 3 dimensions, and mixing their own logics of a space. So in a way, that was something that Khyam included in his thinking. The other part that I think was quite interesting was the logic of fragmentation and layering, which also, all these things I'm saying, try to keep them in mind because they also deploy very presently in all the artists' works in their own ways and vocabularies. In this exercise of layering and fragmentation, perspective becomes also key. There are a few moments in the building when you land from the 5th floor into the 4th floor, and you're looking actually to Andreas Canepa installation. It's a moment when I see these fake perspectives that I've been calling first perspective or forced perspective, which is, we all know that in perspective representation, a parallel line is represented with a focal point, and then you connect those two lines, so then they look like parallel, right? Then that in reality is never going into a focal point, except in this building, where Zaha seems to kind of bring in from the paper and from the representation those perspectives by bringing focal points that exaggerates. The interesting thing is that she doesn't use only one focal point. She uses many random focal points, and that creates this sense kind of lack of horizon, of feeling like floating sometimes, and for sure not any singular real parallel wall. This notion of different punctuations and focal points was also very key for Khyam's proposal for the composition.
Yeah, I'd like to share with you the most experimental part of this, for me at least, which is really directly related to what Maite just brought up now, this idea of perspectives, the 3D and the 2D, the planes, the floor plans, the perspectives, all of these things that can oftentimes get mixed into one painting by Zaha. And I found that really, really inspiring. So I'll give you a very simple but quick music theory lesson here. So aside from the 12-tone equal temperament that I mentioned earlier, there is a physical phenomenon of sound called the harmonic series. And the harmonic series, any note that you hear, any pitched material that you hear, is based on the harmonic series. And what you'll see now when I turn this on and start playing with some sliders, you will first hear a pure tone. So this is a pure, sorry, I'll just turn that down a bit. This is a pure sine wave tone. And most synthesizers and most electric instruments work by adding harmonics. So they add these different partials which are part of this series. And they're just multiplications of each other. So if I make this, I don't know if I can change the number here. No, I can't, but that's fine. You hear that? It's an octave above. So I'm going to continue adding, and if you see this up here, this waveform, this is the complex waveform that starts developing as we combine the frequencies together. You hear it starts to get brighter and a little bit more nasal and a little bit more annoying. if we keep going, you'll see that this will end up becoming, it will look like a square. First it will look like a saw, like sawtooth, and then it will look like a square. And, sorry. And this is a very typical thing. The manipulation of partials of these harmonics are standard in electronic music, digital instruments, etc., etc. And when thinking about Zaha's imaginary and all of her experimentalism, I started thinking, what if we had a synthesizer that didn't rely on the harmonic series? So something that defies the laws of physics as we know it today in terms of music technology and sound. And so I got to coding this very simple looking synthesizer down here. But what this synthesizer does is it takes the tuning system that we developed based on the proportions of the building and turns them into a series of partials. So if I can make it work, what I will do is play you what that sounds like. Let's start with the short facade. And maybe I have to do something funky here. Actually, Maite, can you just... There we go. Can you just press that and hold it? Yeah. You press harder? There you go. So, I'm just going to turn this up a bit. What we're hearing here are all the partials, so I'm going to turn them off. That's one note. This is the next one. Here it sounds very different to what we heard earlier. It's a completely different world. It's a world in and of itself. So thank you, Maite. So as I was building this synthesizer, I started to think a lot about spatialization and how we can think about these multiple focal points in the space, etc. And rather than just having sounds emanate from different speakers, what I've been doing in the composition, as you'll hear upstairs, is actually randomly dispersing these frequencies. So every time a note is triggered, every frequency is randomly thrown into a different space in the building. And so maybe I can, I'll give you an example in stereo rather than in the 8-channel system. Sorry, I can't do these two things at the same time. So let's do that, tear that off. And now. Can you hear it moving? Slowly. Let's turn that down. See if this works. 1 second. Those are the same frequencies, but they're just moving in the stereo field. That's essentially what's happening throughout everything that we hear in the sound installation upstairs, is that the frequencies are constantly being dispersed. So it's very difficult to feel exactly where you are sometimes, and other times it's very, very clear. So I was trying to find a way to represent this 3D versus 2D thing sonically, which is incredibly difficult, but well, this was my attempt at least.
Well, I'm very sad that I think we're kind of running a bit out of time, but I don't want to close without having the chance of seeing. I think we have walked you over all these different ingredients that then deploy in very different ways, and different sets that Khyam has created and that you experience in the space, that sometimes really feels like the space has been densified, so it's like a sound composition that is filling the volume, but other moments it becomes almost as a punctuation of sounds that are existing. And all of them at the beginning might sound kind of like even unstable because you don't recognize the sounds because, as he has explained, even the creation of those frequencies don't belong to the logics of physics that we all know and have been used to hear over and over again. So I would love, before closing, Khyam, for you to maybe play a little bit of one of the, is that, maybe not technically.
I can do something, but it won't be what you'll hear upstairs, just because it's a bit complicated. Yeah. So we don't spoil what you'll hear upstairs in a couple of minutes. But this software is another tool that I developed with Counterpoint Studio. It's called Apotome, and this is a generative music making software. It also runs in the web browser, and it's free for anybody to access. And but for this work, we decided to expand on the original design of it and include what we refer to as LFOs. And I'm just going to start it without making any sound so that we don't kill everybody's ears. As you'll see when I start it, we start to get these waveforms here. And if I change this one, we can do a ramp, for example. And then this one here is, for example, random. So what these LFOs do is that they decide which pitch is going to be triggered of the strange tuning system based on Zaha's proportions, triggering the synthesizer that is based on these partials that are also based on the building, etc. And then underneath, at the bottom here, we have another experimental thing that we built. I hope you can see that. This is basically like a sequencer, like a rhythmic sequencer, but the divisions between each steps are also based on the proportions of the building. So this is why the work is called a relational music, because every single element, from the pitch to the timbre to the timing to the spatialization, everything is related to itself in one way or another. And obviously, because it's resounding in the building that the measurements are based on, therefore it's relational even within that. So I know this is like deep in the wormhole of experimental weirdness, but I find it very exciting that I was able to explore such an experimental concept here and find this particular way to take inspiration from Zaha's curves and her lines. You know, it's very difficult to think about sonifying something or to represent something sonically. And what I tried to do here was to take Zaha's movements, her curves, her lines, the way things feel, the internal logics that seem like they have no logic, that seem like they're completely random, but they're clearly not, because they repeat themselves so much in her work. Particularly, this is one of my favorites. It looks like a graphic score to me. Trying to find that and to represent it within the compositional logic of the installation rather than only in the sonic one. And this particularly was really exciting for me. Because of the proximity of these, what do they call them, the monsoon restaurant paintings, as you'll see upstairs, there's 5 of them. Zaha's monsoon restaurant paintings. We also took some inspiration from these, and in order to render all of that, what we did was we created a visualizer that, sorry, I have to log into the machine, that runs in real time, and you'll be able to see this upstairs. So this here is actually a visualization of the waveforms that are powering the composition that's going on upstairs right now in real time. And each time a note is triggered, you'll see one of the red blocks, and the red turns to gray as the note reaches its end. So on one screen, you will see the system actually running, generating the music, and on the other one, you'll see this. And this was not to try and create a visual representation of the music. It was just to try and show the parallel between Zaha's compositional forms and our compositional forms ultimately. And I say our because Counterpoint Studio were really integral to making this come to life. So yeah, that's what awaits you, alongside all the other beautiful, amazing artworks by all these beautiful, amazing people. And I really wish you would take the time to talk to them as much as you've spent listening to me.
Well, I think with that great ending, I just want to thank you all. And as Khyam has expressed, in the same way that it has been really interesting how the piece that is not visual, is not operating to the visual realm, has allowed us and me, like really thinking I know the building and the space so much, to find how through not visual we can understand a space that usually is represented through the visual. And in the same way that Khyam's work has been able to unearth certain understandings of the compositional logic of Zaha Hadid and the methodologies of work, each of the single artworks that are part of the exhibition by all these amazing artists that are here with us today are doing exactly the same through their own vocabulary, rendering visible a way of being, a way of thinking, and a way of creating and moving forward and thinking towards the future that might not be obvious, but in this way you would really be able to see in a different way a building that most of you have probably think you've fully known and didn't have anything else to discover. You really will find new ways of looking and new gazes through which explore the work by Zaha Hadid. So with that, I think I'm going to close the ground and invite you all to go into the galleries and take the chance of sharing with the artists. We're super lucky to have them, most of them here with us. They are seated here in the front row, so catch their faces and find them in the galleries. Thank you all.